So do you all remember Hobby Lobby, the craft store most famous for some legal battles involving conservative politics? Well, I fell into a bit of a rabbit hole involving the store and its owners, a family of American evangelicals, and how they came into possession of a fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, that was the starting point for me, and only one of many legal troubles for Hobby Lobby as far as ancient artifacts were concerned. We'll see why in a bit. One of the legal battles Hobby Lobby and its owners, the Green family, got into that I think was moved past far too quickly was the 2017 case where it came to light that Hobby Lobby was in possession of several thousand antiquities, obtained through illegal artifact smuggling from Iraq. Now, the first question that comes to mind when I hear Iraqi artifact smuggling in the 20-teens is, did they buy these artifacts from ISIS? Well, short answer, no. The dates don't line up. The 2017 case is about smuggling done in 2010-2011. Beyond that, the Gilgamesh fragment, known as the Dream Tablet, was actually purchased from a private collector in London by Christie's, the British-based international auction house who then sold it to Hobby Lobby in the US, but it likely entered that original collector's hands because of the Gulf War, which Christie's didn't mention, and look, this stuff is going to get immediately messy. So sorry if you were hoping for easy ammunition to load into the conservatives are hypocrites canon of liberal smugness, but no. That said, leaving it there or indeed lamenting that this isn't a quick gotcha risks diminishing the questions raised in the ethics breached. Side note, in the Anglosphere, at least in my experience, ISIS is the most recognizable name for the organization, though I understand why it's an imperfect one and why calling them a state at all seems to lend them legitimacy. Daesh is the common Arabic term, but one I'm less familiar with. However, I hear ISIS doesn't like it too much because it's mocking, translating to something like brutes or bigots. For the sake of common language and intelligibility, I'll be sticking to ISIS. Two quick things that we'll expand on. Hobby Lobby knowingly violated the law despite consulting with experts who advised them on legal processes actively financing the looting of Iraq, and ISIS has explicitly funded itself in the past via participation in the looting of Iraq. Both of these things are true, and they don't have to intersect to be worthy of attention. But when considered together, we can also pull on a particular thread. ISIS was open for business with the West, and corporate entities benefited from the destruction of the Iraqi state. And all of that fails to address a burning question. Why in God's name did Hobby Lobby finance the illegal extraction of Iraqi artifacts? To which the answer is yes. Like, unironically, they did it in God's name, for the sake of their passion project Bible Museum. Don't worry, we'll get there. For now, let's start with a dive into the nature of smuggling artifacts. Artifacts are simple and complex. Let me put it this way. Most people think it's good to preserve the past in some kind of way, to maintain a record and material evidence of history. The complexity comes in when talking about who should take care, or indeed ownership, of what history. And then the answer feels like it should be simple, the cultural inheritors of said history. And while I'll avoid the tremendously long tangent that could be had about arguments of repatriation and long-stolen artifacts, as with the Parthenon marbles, called the Elgin marbles, it should be noted that debates over ownership are ongoing and not one size fits all. That said, it's uncontroversial to note that if we know where something came from, and there are facilities with the means to take care of an artifact, that maybe it should be where it came from. In the past, I've brought up how cultures don't just appear and vanish, nor do they endure statically for centuries. The context originally was in discussing how the game Humankind approaches culture. What's important for our purposes here is establishing that ownership of ancient artifacts and inheriting legacies is a lot more complex than just, well, we found it in the ground where we presently live, so it's our history. This is a different conversation than that of expropriation and repatriation, and there's a solid logic to the idea that the objects should exist in the land they were found, even if, in a practical sense, they can't actually impart much context that way. We can say the objects, their history, belong to everyone, while also expressing they belong where they are. But at the same time, in perspectives that don't embrace a shared universal history, it's not exactly fair to say that the Sumerians belong to everyone any more than history itself does. Largely, this just opens questions over who gets to inherit the legacy of Babylon or broader Mesopotamia, the oft-termed cradle of civilizations, which is why Saddam Hussein's government actually doubled the budget for museums and antiquities. That legacy held import to his vision of the country. He wanted that legacy for his Iraq. His vision of the country was that of an Iraq that could claim descent from the heart of civilization. I imagine much like that of the Hellenic legacy the Greeks hold/inherit. which contrasted with the vision of the country offered by Donald Rumsfeld, which was that of a smoking crater. That's not to say Saddam was a good guy or his increase in archaeology funding was altruistic. Most likely, it flowed from the shared vein of authoritarianism that is an obsession with recovering a past or mythologized legacy. The construction of a new Babylon would depend on the foundations of the old. One legitimating force for illegally obtained artifacts is the very vanguard that is supposed to protect against them, museums and academia. For a dive into that, I recommend a series of articles on the Denver Museum Cambodian artifact scandal, which I will link below. The short of it is that all it takes is one hole, one expert willing to vouch for provenance, and suddenly, stolen works enter the system, and they're then legitimated by having been displayed in museums. Effectively, museums become sites of laundering. Let's look to another lens for exploring this side of museums, an admittedly unorthodox one. Without provenance, The Making of Contemporary Antiquity is the name of an exhibition put on at American University in the Katzen Gallery by Jim Sanborn in 2018. The exhibition appeared to show off 12th century Cambodian Khmer artifacts, but as you might have picked up by way of the paradoxical name or my wording, the artifacts were contemporary, that is, replicas, that is, forged. The wall text at no point explicitly said the artifacts were fake, but there were parts of the exhibit that showed them being made, and one small bit of wall text that mentioned the artist was trained by people who created forgeries to sell to museums that allegedly knew these works were fake. The Katzen, of course, knew all of this and was hosting a statement, not a lie. The fascinating detail here, and this could be its own entire video, is that these fakes, in the style of antiquity, that a layman may not be able to pick apart, are arguably more ethical for a culturally disconnected museum to collect. In this, we see a tension of replication and authenticity and just generally open ourselves up to the question of what the point of a museum even is and how to navigate things like theft and harm and inauthenticity. We also open up the question that we're following forward. How aware of smuggling and illegal purchases are the museums? The artifact market as a whole operates in such a way where legitimate and illegitimate goods intermingle. In some sense, this is inevitable, given the way lack of provenance is a key element of it all, and the point of laundering sites is to legitimate illegal acquisitions. It also reinforces a lack of culpability on the seller end, as we'll see later. The Khmer artifacts case, meaning the Denver one, brings up one more angle to discuss. Enter private collection. Private collection is rather unambiguously considered bad by archaeologists who largely believe in ownership as public heritage and believe artifacts ought to belong in museums or with their cultural inheritors. Problem is, private collection is unambiguously accepted as a function of the ecosystem that is museums and curation. With the aforementioned Khmer artifacts, the fact the smuggler was a private collector who donated parts of his collection to the Cambodian government and its museums not only gave him legitimacy, but was celebrated as a philanthropy of sorts until it came to light he was looting in order to do it. Now that's not to say private collection has no place in the museum world. When it comes to art history, patronage and private ownership of artworks is foundational from the early modern period onward. Individuals owned and funded the creation of art, and thus owned the artwork. There's a fundamental difference between owning a commissioned painting, even if it wasn't commissioned by you or your family, and laying a personal claim to a piece of antiquity. All that said, private ownership is heavily regulated and generally illegal in Iraq, as is removing items from Iraq. So there's not really a question in terms of practical law here over if Hobby Lobby's actions were in breach of local law. Hobby Lobby was, of course, informed about all of this, as explained in what may be one of the most amusingly named legal cases in US history, United States of America versus approximately 450 ancient cuneiform tablets and approximately 3,000 ancient clay bullae. The case is made and indeed settled on Hobby Lobby's culpability. Here's an excerpt.
The expert's memorandum further advised Hobby Lobby that cultural property looted from Iraq since 1990 is specifically protected by import restrictions that carry criminal penalties and fines. The expert's memorandum was received by in-house counsel, but was not shared with Hobby Lobby's president, consultant, executive assistant, international department, outside customs brokers, or anyone involved in the purchase and importation.
In an attempt to avoid said culpability once advised that the purchases may not be legal, Hobby Lobby effectively handed the reins to the dealers.
The International Department advised the curator and executive assistant that the artifacts should be imported using the customs broker. However, after the customs broker reported that the artifacts could be detained by the CBP, the curator and executive assistant decided to bypass the International Department and customs broker and have Israeli dealers number 1 and number 2 handle the shipping arrangements for the order.
There's also some creative financing and other events that make it very clear that any ignorance on their part of what they were doing was willful. Much of the case involves a claim to ignorance, usually undercut by knowing actions, that is, things you would only do if you knew you were doing something wrong. For example, the president did not receive the aforementioned memorandum, but he did authorize defrauding customs by having his shipments addressed to adjacent businesses. The executive assistant later said in an email to Emirati dealers, "As long as you keep the value of each package under $2,000, they will not have to forward it to our broker to clear it through customs." Beyond splitting shipments up to try and be below a monetary threshold, the UAE dealers also lied about the value of packages.
On or about and between December 26, 2010 and December 5, 2011, the UAE dealer shipped approximately 8 packages to Hobby Lobby via FedEx. Each package contained between 12 and 300 pieces of artifacts, and the value of the contents of each package therefore exceeded $2,000. The UAE dealer supplied false invoices and false shipping declarations that substantially undervalued the pieces being shipped and stated that each package was worth between $250 and $300.
The UAE dealers started shipping packages in November of 2010. January 3, 2011 is when the first package was actually detained and the investigation began in earnest. By the time of the first customs interception, we're at around 15 packages sent, with 5 being intercepted in order. The Israeli dealers shipped their packages in September of 2011. Apologies if this is a bit in the weeds, but I want to establish how structured and ongoing it all was. This was not a snap decision to break the law once and try to avoid consequences. It was a full process of several shipments over a span of time with communication between involved parties. It wasn't a biblical artifact impulse buy. Later, Hobby Lobby also got caught out on a lie about their wire transfers. Ultimately, they forfeited the artifacts in question and they were set for repatriation in 2018. There have been more repatriations since this 2017 case. Mind you, this case did not result in the return of all objects obtained by Hobby Lobby. Yes, the roughly 3,800 artifacts directly addressed in the case were returned, but there were thousands, over 10,000 more items in Hobby Lobby's possession that were only later returned. Rather comically, given how willful the ignorance was, the CEO later remarked that he got in over his head and knew little about the world of collecting. They still retain some artifacts, and by virtue of gray markets, they have the right to do so. In a sense, the $3 million punishment was a fee, not a fine. Noted in the legal documents for the Hobby Lobby case is that the importation of illegally removed Iraqi cultural artifacts has been against US law since the 1990s, following a general goods embargo that was later lifted in 2004. Save for Iraqi cultural property or other items of archaeological, historical, cultural, rare scientific, and religious importance illegally removed from the Iraq National Museum, the National Library, and other locations in Iraq since August 6, 1990. This has been a known concern since 1990, which really only serves to beg further questions about how all this happened. How exactly did such massive quantities of Iraqi artifacts enter the gray market of antiquities? So we come to the context by which Hobby Lobby vicariously participated in the looting of Iraq. In 2009, Lawrence Rothfield published The Rape of Mesopotamia, Behind the Looting of the Iraq Museum, a book centered on the American toppling of Saddam Hussein and the negligence said toppling force had towards the National Museum, which was looted of thousands of artifacts which then entered the illegal artifacts market. Per the introduction of his book,
at the very moment when the Bush administration was seeking, with some success, to cement the invasion's meaning by staging an act of iconoclasm against the statue of Saddam Hussein, the sacking of the museum offered an equally potent iconoclastic image carrying the opposite message. If the toppling of Saddam's statue was intended to stand for the triumph of liberty over tyranny, the inability to prevent the carrying off of the museum's statues signalled that American-style liberty meant lawlessness.
The book seeks to explore not only why the museum was able to be looted, but what followed, and the industry that is illegal artifact acquisition and smuggling. It is, in effect, a snapshot of the conditions within which the majority of Hobby Lobby's acquisitions entered the market. I will note here expressly that the book does not cover Hobby Lobby itself, but as we'll see, the market is slow to transform. That said, if anyone has sources they prefer to this one, feel free to drop them in the comments. The broad strokes of the book is that there was no real plan for protecting from looting and no real response once it started happening.
The failure to take steps to prevent the looting of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, and the less publicised though far more devastating ongoing looting of Iraq's archaeological sites, must be understood within this larger short-term context of failure to protect any number of arguably more important assets. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's well-documented desire for invading forces to go in lighter and faster required jettisoning supposedly inessential forces from the first wave, and this meant there simply would be too few boots on the ground in Baghdad to be able to spare tanks to guard buildings, including but by no means limited to the museum. But it would be a mistake to assume that Rumsfeld's strategic preference for speed, the rush to war, or even the tactical decision to punch into Baghdad were the only factors sealing the fate of the museum.
Fundamental to many issues in the general post-operation peacekeeping process was the United States military's general lack of a policing force, which the book notes has been a known issue since at least the Gulf War. Compounding that was a lack of coordination with local policing forces and a general, what I'd call, indifference to the task. Funding was not readily set aside for the role. Compared to NATO, the US military has very little in the ways of actual peacekeeping organization or training. William Sumner of the US military and a trained archaeologist was assigned to the task of keeping record of and in some sense protecting cultural sites months before the invasion. In his planning, he and his team were neither given funds towards security nor had any expectation that sites like the National Museum would not be secured. They took it as a given, and looting was not a topic of much, if any, consideration. Fun fact, Sumner also happened to get involved with the Baghdad Zoo, which had its own crisis following the invasion, and even wrote a children's book about it. April 5th was the first day of the full invasion of Baghdad. By April 8th, Sumner requested to be put on the ground or to have some assessment done of the museum, worried as he was that it had been overlooked. He recalled Army Brigadier General John Kern responding to him with, "Captain, if you don't think that commander is securing that museum, you don't know what you are talking about." It later became clear to Sumner, to everyone, that said securing had not happened. By the 10th of April, looting had spread to Basra. Soon after, the archaeological community feared it would go beyond the cities to archaeological sites. In shock and outrage, the Archaeological Institute of America, AIA, and the American Association for Research in Baghdad, the AARB, sent letters to the military brass citing international law and the requirement to protect cultural sites from looting. In error, they failed to notice that said law applies to looting by warring factions, not by civilians under a regime change occupation. I say that blithely to remind that as much as there are conventions of war, there are also technicalities and bureaucracies. I also say it with the note that it is my personal opinion that the lack of applicability of an obligation afforded by a 1954 and 1999 international law are not what kept the US military from protecting cultural sites. In essence, the hope was that the Iraqis would pick up the slack eventually, with no real stopgap plan for what to do in that interim period of training and rearming. I imagine this partly stemmed from a neoconservative expectation of gratitude over toppling Hussein's regime, mixed with the neoconservative drive to cut any and all government involvement that isn't an expansion of policing, given the whole Department of Homeland Security thing. I won't belabor this point much further. The conditions that led to the museum being looted were those of ill preparedness and indifference on many levels, spread across several organizations and compounded by an absence of communication or indeed an absence of willingness to communicate with the concerned parties. Now, practically, when it comes to the museum, what happened? Staff of the museum were ostensibly drafted by the government, that is, the Iraqi government, to serve as armed guards of the museum, given uniforms and everything. As the American invasion rapidly progressed, it became pretty clear that the job would be not only futile and confusing, given the imminent collapse of Iraqi authority, but also outright dangerous, given the staff were, again, more or less drafted. Some of the staff stayed to protect the building, while others, very understandably, chose to instead leave the active war zone. Eventually, as the Americans advanced further, insurgent forces set up in the museum and fortified the building for the sake of combat, not for the sake of protecting artifacts. Apparently, as the US forces progressed through Baghdad, quote, the civilians would come right in behind them, carrying, rolling, and hauling away anything that was not anchored in steel or cement. By the time of all the archaeological communities upset over the invasion, it had already been 2 days of the museum being undefended. The museum's artifacts were just accepted to be, by now, on the international antiquities market. Looting began sometime in this haze during or following the insurgents' occupation of the building. Complicating this matter is the fact that when looters broke in, they also ransacked the admin departments of the museum, destroying non-digitized records, making it very, very hard to know what the museum even had to begin with. Another thing to note here is the mix of amateur and professional thieves. Some storerooms were looted in a fashion where prized items were left behind and fakes were stolen, indicating an untrained eye, while others were struck with precision and expertise. Most of the damaging work was done with discernment. One anecdote from this, however, is that, professional or no, some artifacts were spared by virtue of incompetence. In one case, a set of keys that would have unlocked some of the most high-value storage spaces was dropped into a pile of debris, and there are signs that the room was abandoned once looters tried to light some foam on fire for a light source and couldn't stand the toxic fumes they'd just created. That aside, much of the museum was not spared, and thousands of artifacts were looted. I won't play the what-if game here and suggest some hindsight opinion that the US military should have swept back around and secured the building and then no looting would have happened. We don't know, and indeed cannot know, how bad the damage already was during the brief insurgency. And for our purposes, what matters now isn't following the conditions of the museum, but the position of the collection, which was, of course, the antiquities market. There is, however, a second stream of artifacts that needs to be followed. The National Museum accounts for a majority share of known artifacts looted, but artifacts come from somewhere. So let's look at the way looting affected the places from which the artifacts came, the sites of antiquity. Concurrent with, but stretching beyond the initial invasion, archaeological sites also faced looting. In fact, said looting began before and carried on well past the invasion, in some estimates until the end of August, some through 2004, and in others indefinitely. It's here that I'll sidestep for an important and, frankly, uncomfortable ethical discussion. Is the looting of antiquity sites any worse than stealing a loaf of bread if the looter is starving and uses their gains to feed a family? It's very easy to say, no, of course not. The lives of contemporary living people trump the value of a recorded, static, dead past. Most of me agrees, but a twisted pragmatic historian in me gets uncomfortable at the idea of forever losing the ability to understand history because of pillaging. And to quickly address this in 2 ways. 1. The starving looter is not and can never be the problem. The problem is the world they live in, which has deprived them of food and a means to live. That, if anything, is responsible for the destruction of the past, even if vicariously. 2. It remains to be addressed if the primary looters even do so out of starvation, are even among the poor. As seen with the National Museum, there were both desperate folks who grabbed whatever they could and often took fakes, and there were professional thieves angling for artifacts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. That said, the looting of the countryside was often conducted by people trained by the Iraqi government to recognize valuable artifacts. Questions of needs and class and culpability and poverty rely on presuming the items draw their value from the ether, that there is no market willingly offering up millions to buy what are, in effect, simultaneously artifacts of antiquity and products of conflict. Ultimately, it remains important to keep in mind who is placing value on these items and who is seeking to own them. Individual ownership of shards of a collectively inherited past is the problem there. Another tangent here, and I promise this one will actually be short, is that the drive for antiquities is inherently destructive to the archaeological process. Archaeologists record things like sediment layers for dating purposes, location for context. When an artifact is ripped out of the ground to be sold on the market, it is done without a record of context. Much of the things it could tell us about the past washed away with the item's extraction and laundering. But let's move on. By May, it appears that structures were forming to deal with the museum crisis, but the looting of archaeological sites was still significant. Mind you, Iraq was, and is still not, mostly dug up. More artifacts remain in the ground than in storerooms and on shelves. While the work is harder to identify them because they've never been cataloged before, the gray market also laps them up easier because they've never been cataloged before. Many, and I mean many, archaeological invested organizations from the West got involved at this point, ranging from individual museums to government agencies. Much of the effort here was spent on trying to track things down, return them to museums, and stop them from entering gray markets. In essence, an international coalition of academics, NGOs, and government agencies started working to clean up the mess left by the invasion. One such organization, bearing possibly the worst and wordiest name I've ever seen for a UN org, the UNESCO Intergovernmental Committee for Promoting the Return of Cultural Property to its Countries of Origin or its Restitution in the Case of Illicit Appropriation, ICPRCP, connected these orgs to enforcement arms like Interpol and distributed a master list of sorts of the stolen artifacts as yet known. Despite my prior mention of America's plan being that Iraq would police itself, it has to be noted here that the looting problem was in part exacerbated by the disarmament of both political and military structures within the country. This means that unarmed guards with no connections to a political apparatus or authority were expected to competently police sites that were often looted by armed groups. Mind you, this whole process of getting other agencies involved, inviting security forces from other countries, and even just assessing where damage had been done in the first place took months. The State Department, that is, US State Department, the de facto government in Iraq at the time, announced a coalition team to, quote, assist in rebuilding Iraq's cultural heritage infrastructure on July 14th, more than 3 months after the region fell into their control. The damage was well done by that point. Oh, and the coalition had no provisions or mandate for providing security to sites, despite evidence that looting was hitting an industrial stride with electrical lighting and round-the-clock teams at some sites. One particular site that was actually under American control before the invasion, indeed a site being monitored by American archaeologists since 1900, was Nippur. The site had, by all accounts, in American hands, never faced looting before now. This made it a target not by indiscriminate looters, but by dealers within the antiquities trade. At this stage in the whole thing, and this is where we'll leave the blow-by-blow behind, it appeared that nobody had expressly connected the idea of looting with funding channels for insurgents, terrorists, what have you. And again, I won't pretend that my hindsight should dictate what could have been done, but the general structure of selling antiquities to buy arms and loyalties was a known element by this point. Given the cost of a dubiously obtained AK-47 in Iraq in 2003 was estimated at around $150, I imagine looted cylinders in cuneiform worth anywhere from a few thousand to $100,000 in the market might have been a viable revenue stream for insurgency. And it was also established that market connections more or less ran in ways that made antiquities go out, guns come in, the way of things. Smuggling networks don't need to be made from the ground up just to ship artifacts. They use the channels that already exist. And indeed, these channels would be used again in the future, but we'll get there. We have one last tangent to get into. One question raised by the Dream Tablet, that is the slice of the Epic of Gilgamesh at one time purchased by Hobby Lobby, a question raised by an object that entered the market one entire war earlier, is of transitive criminality and the passage of time. The crime of looting the Dream Tablet took place during the Gulf War of the 90s, the smuggling into the US proper in 2003, and the obtaining by Hobby Lobby as late as 2017. But the law can't just go, oh well, it changed hands, so it's not stolen anymore, it would be unfair to make them give it back, even if they hadn't been aware of the conditions of its provenance. I bring this up now, at this moment, to clarify that even as time progresses from the invasion, as it did with the Gulf War, things were still looted, objects still hit markets, still funded dubious enterprises. There is no world in which Hobby Lobby could amass the quantity of Iraqi artifacts that it did without the destruction of the National Museum and the looting industry around antiquity sites, and both of those things required there to be an American invasion and subsequent disinterest in the establishment of a new power structure. Some of their artifacts weren't just formerly unidentified and looted from dig sites, but were once housed in Iraqi museums. But for all intents and purposes, this is where the Hobby Lobby involvement drops off. All their illegal acquisitions indirectly stemmed from the Iraq War or further back. They residually got in on a wave of unethical smuggling that required the destruction or otherwise mass destabilization of the region. But this train of thought has a few more stops if you want to journey into how things changed with ISIS, and ultimately it arrives at a set of perhaps challenging ethical questions about the interplay of the West and the crime of heritage destruction. The biggest change between the post-invasion era and the ISIS era as far as artifacts are concerned was one of approach. The remnants of a Ba'athist insurgency loyal to the old Iraqi state may have counted religious members among them, but their cause was ostensibly secular. ISIS, on the other hand, was very concerned with religion, and inevitably this informed the way their quote-unquote state functioned, socially, politically, and arguably economically. One of the cultural traditions of Sunni Islam not unique to the Islamic State is aniconism. An, not, icon, image. To those more familiar with Western religious tradition, think of it like the notion of idolatry, or, as you may have heard in a Byzantine context, iconoclasm. If you've ever seen art in a Sunni tradition, you may note there's not a lot of representational artwork when it comes to human figures. More famously, images of Muhammad are considered blasphemous. Unsurprisingly, a fundamentalist religious group like ISIS takes this tradition rather seriously, and unsurprisingly, they also don't have much respect for pagan antiquity. Put those two together and the outcome is, at best, disregard for relics of the past, representational or pagan, and at worst, active endeavors to destroy them. The Taliban, another fundamentalist group, though not a strictly Sunni one, and one that is at war with ISIS remnants, destroyed a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Afghanistan, the Buddhas of Bamiyan. At one point in the process of deliberating their destruction, Swedish monument experts allegedly offered to fund fixing the statues, and this angered the Taliban, who then argued that money should go towards feeding starving children, not statues. But the hitch in that argument is that the Taliban was also approached with an offer to buy these statues. Keep that in mind. India offered to house them. Neither offer was accepted and the statues were destroyed. For the Taliban, at that stage, the destruction was part of their ideological mission. Having the objects gone from their presence was not the goal, having them gone from the world was. In 2018, researchers Emma Cunliffe and Luigi Curini published an analysis titled ISIS and Heritage Destruction, a Sentiment Analysis, looking into the reactions on social media to ISIS's destruction of cultural artifacts. The analysis sought to find both intent and effect, i.e., why ISIS was doing this and how people reacted in turn, and ultimately in doing so, shed a light on both motivation and social media strategy for the organization. I don't have the knowledge or the space to delve into it, but just know that ISIS is unique among terrorist organizations in modern history for really embracing social media. One such embracement was in posting videos that show the destruction of heritage sites, and sometimes the execution of people associated with the maintenance of said sites, like when they captured Palmyra. Now, what this study enlightens us to is that ISIS was strategic in what destructions or desecrations they posted and what they downplayed. Some suggestions in the past have been that they would blow up a statue following a military loss, in order to try and overshadow their loss in a war on the West with a win in the war on stone. This study provides another interpretation. Many of the destructions were not broadcast, so it couldn't have just been, for lack of a better term, social media clout seeking. Destruction of places such as cemeteries were actively downplayed. Much of the destruction did come from a genuine religious motivation. The motivations tend toward both religious conviction and social media attention, though the latter is far more calculated and the former far more inconsistent. But maybe, sometimes, compromises have to be made in pursuit of more pressing goals. It turned out such was the case for ISIS. Despite what some preachers say, faith cannot feed the people. As the war with the West raged on, the Islamic State was, at times, denied access to its usual revenue streams of oil and cotton. Now, the economy within ISIS territory is as complex as it is simple. Much of it is funded by captured wealth, with the rest being resource extraction. For the most part, they took over operations that were already going on in the regions they captured, much the same to the artifact smuggling business. In fact, one suggestion from the prior study is that some artifact destruction was ostensibly a smokescreen for looting. As such, the smuggling of artifacts is presumed, as much as it is understood, to follow similar channels as before. The sale of looted artifacts has at one point or another been speculated as the second largest share of revenue for ISIS, only behind oil. Part of the reason for that second place spot, however, is down to the other revenue streams being cut off or bombed, as is the case with cotton, and ultimately their entire financial situation is unclear. The 2017 EU Parliament report on the financials of ISIS places the value lower, or lumps it in with other forms of plunder which do significantly contribute, such as seizing banks. The real important part to grasp from the EU report is that ISIS was operating on a state scale, that is, with resource generation and ministries. The EU report does mention that it has little in the ways of data collection with respect to what we've here otherwise called the grey market of antiquities, and that cooperating states have yet to, at least of when the report came out, submit any information to the committee. That said, a 2015 piece from The Guardian states archaeologists have recognized looting on an industrial scale. Forgive that this is a citation of The Guardian which merely quotes Irina Bokova, the then head of the UN Cultural Agency UNESCO, rather than a quote from her, but I couldn't find a direct statement, and other articles from the time corroborate it. In essence, there are clear signs that heritage looting and antiquities sales are expressly part of ISIS's revenue stream and not merely incidental to it. Unlike the material resources such as cotton, which hit the market broadly, the intended market for artifacts, the one they reached, was Europe. Doctrinally, the only thing that matters to ISIS on paper is the creation of a unitary hardline state, according to their personal interpretation of Sunni Islam, which has been noted to be one with inconsistent application of law. Hard aniconism, destructive iconoclasm, and the rending of the pagan past into dust is an easy goal for them. Lives aren't wagered in waging war on statues and tablets. But also, explosives are expensive and destroying artifacts doesn't win wars. So they started selling these artifacts, the same way they sold the resources of the land they captured. Pariahs though they were as far as condemnations and speeches were concerned, ISIS was not shut off from the global economy. In turn, this leaves us with a different question from the Parthenon example, and also a more difficult one. Bearing in mind that the artifacts would be otherwise destroyed, what should be done with them? Is there an ethical breach in purchasing them? And that loops around, proving itself to be the wrong question. Much like the question of workers, petty looters, the poor, even thieves looting dig sites in the prior section, we have a reframe. Instead, it ought to be asked, in a world without private collection, without a market of exclusion and indifferent financiers, would ISIS have as much of a reason to industrialize extraction, to bother getting rid of heritage? While certainly there are many ethical implications to funding ISIS and no question over if ISIS had the right to sell or smuggle these items, there's three concerns there. One being the aforementioned alternative is destruction. Another, that real human lives were being actively ruined, and the saving of old stones versus the saving of human lives is an ethical quagmire all its own. The third, though, is that ISIS wouldn't be selling the artifacts if there wasn't a willing Western market, and more tellingly, an established means of trade with the alleged international pariah. There were ways to get through the wall. On the 13th of November 2015, the city of Paris, France, experienced a series of attacks by terrorists. You may remember it for reasons ranging from the personal, of having been there or knowing someone who was, to the news stories, speeches, and press releases, to the global response that swept social media. Chances are you have a relative on Facebook that still has a French flag version of their profile picture that, before that, remained the same since 2012 anyway. It's a bit glib to mention that in the face of a terror attack, but it will actually become relevant in a way that displays a certain mindset and exposes an improper framing I've put forth already. In a lecture-turned-book titled Our Wound is Not So Recent, delivered following the Paris terror attack in November of 2015, philosopher Alain Badiou addresses the attack, its root, and potential consequences. I will someday address this work again, but I also encourage the curious to read the whole of it. It's only 14,000 words or so about 1.5 times this script. I will note, for the people who check it out early, he uses the word identitarian, which might sound familiar as a right-wing dog whistle, but he doesn't mean it in that way. Also, he's not the end of the conversation, given his occasional speaking on behalf of people he may not be equipped to speak for. For now, two elements of his lecture intersect with our interests: the empowerment of corporations like Hobby Lobby, and the concept of what Badiou refers to as zoning. Let's take that in order. Badiou's framework with respect to corporations may not particularly surprise anyone who has been paying attention during the 21st century or has a grasp on the events of the 20th century since the tail end of the Cold War.
The triumph of globalized capitalism is a self-evident fact, of which everyone is conscious. Today, the world market is the absolute reference of planetary historicity. At every moment, it is a question of the world market. Thus, we see that large firms, for example the largest French firm, Total, pay no tax in France. So in what does their quote Frenchness lie? Well, their headquarters are somewhere in Paris, but the French state, as you can see, does not really have any hold, even on concentrated poles of power that proclaim their French nationality. What is in progress is a victory, a vast and ramified victory, of transnational firms over the sovereignty of states. The power of the great industrial banking and retail conglomerates coincides neither with the state sphere, nor even with that of coalitions of states. This capitalist power crosses over states, as if it were at once independent of them and mistress of them.
His point, to recapitulate it, is that corporations have outgrown the ability to be reasonably governed while also recursively enabling the withering of the state. Such is the way of privatization, whereas corporations are given more, they take more, and the more they take, the less the state can reasonably step in. Corporations, as he puts it, can now rival mid-sized states in their power and wealth. Zoning is an interesting alternative to privatization. In the past, I've mentioned something called the walled world, and I would like to introduce that idea again, if only briefly, to then introduce the notion of zones. This video is bloated as is without me trying to cram in an entire framework for understanding contemporary geopolitics. It should be sufficient enough to say that we are in an era where migration is highly controlled, highly controversial, and driven by the outright destruction of states. The proliferation of harder borders, a walled world, or what has been called a global apartheid is fundamental to what happened to Iraq and the base principles of Badiou's zones. So let's get to what Badiou calls zoning.
I think that what is appearing on the horizon is the idea that rather than taking control of the arduous task of establishing states under the supervision of the metropolis, or further still, of directly metropolitan states, the possibility is that we simply destroy states. And you can see how consistent this possibility is with the progressive destatization of globalized capitalism. After all, in certain geographical spaces full of dormant wealth, we can create free, anarchic zones where there is no longer any state, and where consequently we no longer have to enter into communication with that redoubtable monster that the state always is, even when it is weak. To designate these new practices of imperialism, namely destroying states rather than corrupting or replacing them, I have proposed the word zoning. I have suggested that the imperialism that fabricated cut-up pseudo-countries any old how, but countries that had the status of countries under the supervision of the metropolis, has now been replaced in Africa, in the Middle East, and in certain regions of Asia by infrastate zones, which in reality are areas of non-state pillaging. In these zones, we must no doubt intervene militarily from time to time, but without truly having responsibility for the laborious integral management of colonial states, nor even needing to keep in place, through corruption, a whole clique of local accomplices who profit from the functions granted them to pillage resources and wealth.
A connection he draws but does not conclude here, one which I would argue, is that zoning is not merely an efficiency to corporations, a practice born of the hope to convenience them, but a product of the mindset which granted us privatization. What I mean is this. In the Cold War, the motivations for tipping a state to one's respective side were many. Strategic mobility, resources, alliances, things that in part necessitated states. Even with privatization efforts, the state must still be maintained to protect the overseas resources, to protect the rights of ownership. But states are, as Badiou posits, an inconvenience. And as ISIS proves, and as much as they desired to be a state, resources can still enter markets from zoned spaces. And finally, we get to the point. Hobby Lobby's actions represented both elements of Badiou's framework. It is through Hobby Lobby we see the dual contempt for the state. We see a contempt in dealing with state entities at the end of extraction, as evidenced by the willful participation in the purchase of illegally obtained artifacts of a known dubious origin. And we see the contempt of their native state in the form of defrauding the government, of understanding customs laws as hassle, as red tape, as the government being a nuisance, being useless. Saddam's Iraq could withhold its resources from the market, could ask more for them. A properly rebuilt Iraq would not sell artifacts, would be an oil-rich state. A contemporary rebuilding Iraq got many of its antiquities back. ISIS could only ever sell them, drunk on the dream of a global caliphate, one the West wouldn't humor but would tolerate the boozy breath of. The United States government, in enforcing its laws, was only able to restore a partial quantity of artifacts, despite possession of any from Iraq being against the law. It only asked of Hobby Lobby, a company worth $5 to $6 billion, to pay a $3 million fine for facilitating irreparable damage to heritage sites. I will not suggest that Hobby Lobby had a hand in or produced the destabilization of Iraq like a modern-day banana republic, but it profited from the destruction. And so it is we discover the relation between zoning, ISIS, and Hobby Lobby. Gone is the relevance of models like banana republics. Why bother? A strong, nay, merely functional Iraq could represent itself. Could, in a world that promises a voice to all states via functions like the UN, flex a degree of independence. Could, in theory, strengthen tariffs, expand trade laws, restrict resource sales, focus on its own people. Then again, there is one more hitch. Profit is an odd word to use here. The end goal for Hobby Lobby was not one of profit. It was, in a recursive way, in the service of religious ideology. Again, why in God's name did Hobby Lobby have a fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh? Yes. Simply, yes. The point of all the smuggling, of all the illegal purchase, of willfully evading the law with an implicit contempt for the state was in the name of the Museum of the Bible. Ultimately, we must also face a third thing brought up by Badiou, the global French patriotism. In all the models, walled world, global north versus south, general income equality, west versus rest, there will be shared elements. Neo-colonialism, that is, colonization through inequality, furthering inequality, has led us to a uniform point, expressed no better than in the French profile picture. Imagine the state of things in 2015. A terror attack rocks Paris and the world gasps. But is that the case? Is this French 9/11? Will the date live on in infamy? Or as Badiou noted, why is it that there was no similar reaction, no similar allegedly global sympathy offered up to the victims of Boko Haram? Syria has been reduced to rubble, but no flags were waved, no Syrian colors shined upon Western monuments in solidarity. The othering is clear. Call them zones, walled spaces, neo-colonies, the effect is largely the same. There is the West, and there is the places where these things happen. There is the United States and Washington, D.C.'s National Mall with all its museums, and there is Iraq and Baghdad, where these things happen. The travesty of Iraq to the west was the loss of provenance of archaeological detail, of artifacts themselves. And yes, I, along with many archaeologists, were quick to recognize the odd pettiness of saving stones during multi-level humanitarian crises. But that said, there is a poetic irony in the belief in a shared heritage of humanity on one hand, an ideal of protecting the past meeting with the collective wound represented by the international French flag adoption and the absence of such an affect towards Iraq, towards Syria. The West does not grieve for the other. I am not quick to call this a symptom of economic inequality itself or of lacking political strength or a cultural thumbprint. A terror attack in China would not see folks in the American heartland who have never left their state take on a Chinese flag. Likewise, race is a tricky delineation, for terror attacks in Russia also elicit little response. So is it allies? India would show otherwise. It is likely a mix, a hodgepodge that creates a like us and an other. That is where I think a concept like the walled world could be helpful, with changes. Global North and Global South are locked to geography and economies, forced to fight semantics, to caveat places like Russia and much of the former bloc. But my point has been made, and this is well beyond tangential. To return with everything we have on hand, Hobby Lobby, a company with no connection to the funding of ISIS, purchased a massive quantity of artifacts of the past through intermediaries and a gray market which is not only tolerated but a critical element of the world of art, collections, and antiquity. ISIS, a terrorist organization then fledgling quasi-state, partly funded itself through the sale of artifacts onto an intermediary gray market which not only tolerates said sale through passivity, but actively enables them through the production of provenance. Neither of these things would have been possible, or at least as rampant, had it not been for the active destruction and passive negligence of the Iraqi state in 2003. One of the ultimate thoughts we're stuck here with is also that these weren't secret items. They were on display in a museum, acquired in a modern context, not the anything goes days of archaeological imperialism. It was not a problem that they were in the museum until the provenance was questioned. So, from that, we have to conclude that the ethical breach as far as governments were concerned was not the extraction of the artifacts, but the illegal extraction, the irresponsible and inappropriate use of gray market channels, the unacceptable provenance. Before the case was cracked, the accepted narrative for the Dream Tablet was something to do with Christie's and a private collector, and the questions ended there. And isn't that odd? The conclusion of events wasn't one in which there were deep punitive repercussions, nor one where the actual grievance was addressed. The implication of it all is not that it's improper to acquire a people's cultural legacy, but that there are improper ways of doing so. Notably, Hobby Lobby lost the case and had to pay a hefty fine, but that fine more or less transformed itself into an added fee when one considers that they retained somewhere near 17,000 artifacts after the case. Those artifacts, of course, are gray. They're not certifiably illegal. The whole market is gray, and that's just an accepted fact. Personal denial of culpability means that since some sources are legitimate, we presume they all are until proven otherwise, when the opposite should be true. As it stands, we know ISIS made a lot of money through heritage liquidation, through the sale of artifacts. As we know, purchase of Iraqi artifacts, despite blanket illegality and the fact that they absolutely financed criminal, if not terrorist elements even pre-ISIS, were happening. A remarkable element of all this is how much the core rule just seems to be, don't get caught. Perhaps a reframing of sorts is necessary. I understand the principle of innocent until proven guilty, and in turn how that freedom facilitates a gray market, but think of it in terms of blood diamonds. Call the smuggled things conflict cuneiform blood bulli, because in the market that refuses to discern the source, they're all tainted until proven otherwise. The absence of a provenance is supposed to be a red flag, not a free pass. The fabrication of a provenance is complicity with a blood trade. The volume of these things entering the market without the zoning of Iraq would be far, far lower, and the human toll to put them on the market would be far, far lower. To some, that's a fair trade. Hi, this one was a bit more research heavy and a little dry, a real works cited kind of video. It's been a while since one of those. Thanks to everyone who helped, including, in order of appearance, Legal Kimchi, who voiced the legal doc section, because I thought that was fun, Armchair Egyptology, who read from the Mesopotamia book and did a draft read, I should include, and Andy of Satanic Panic, who read for Badiou. And of course, thanks goes out to my patrons, without whom this would be less sustainable a thing of me to be doing with my time. I'd like to particularly thank John Ursaw, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Mark Soto, Nick, Neon Suggestion, and Queen Naked Mole Rat. Who knows where things go from here? I've got a backlog of like 50 topics that grows faster than I can cut through it. Maybe someday there will be a part 2 of this, where I tear into the Museum of the Bible for doing literal crimes? We'll see. Bye.